Thank you for coming along tonight to this important issue around affordable and social housing. I'm Tammy Hollins, minister here at Normanhurst Uniting Church. If anyone throughout this evening needs the bathroom and you're not quite sure where they are, it's just out through this door and out towards your right and then to your left. So they're just there. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce to you Martin Levine, who is the Presbytery Growth and Mission Minister. And he's going to introduce our speakers today. Just before we do that, I just want to acknowledge the land that we are on is the Darug and Guringai people's land, and make acknowledgement to their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge their connection with the land. Thanks, Martin.
Good evening. It's great to see you this evening, and there are a few less than what we had when we did this forum last time. I think part of it is that, and I think this is maybe what we're also struggling with, is that this particular issue is one which maybe gets less and fewer headlines, gets people less riled up in terms of what was before. But in fact, it's one that needs to be dealt with and needs to be understood and connected. And this is the whole point for this opportunity today, is to come and to do that. So welcome. Thank you very much for your welcome, Tammy. I want to also, as much as we are on the particular land of these people, to acknowledge, in fact, all the lands that we come from. Some of us will come from other lands and from other peoples, in fact, in the tribal nature. And so I want to actually read an acknowledgement of First Peoples that come from what was an order of service that was developed by the Inland Mission, or what is now called Frontier Services. And I think it's a beautiful one that acknowledges our First Peoples. And it says this: "From before recorded time, the First Peoples of this nation have cared for this land. We praise the Creator for the beauty of this land and honor those who have cared for it. We acknowledge the elders and community members who have told the sacred stories and nurtured faithfulness to the Creator. We ask God's blessing on those who continue to work for the healing and restoration of this land and her communities." I think restoration is part of what we're talking about in terms of making sure that people have a place to live. And not just a house, not just a roof over their heads, but a home. Because in fact, that's what we're looking for. Not just a shelter, but a home. And it's those things that we want to come and acknowledge today and say how we can work together to actually make that happen. So we're going to have our three speakers come and speak to us, and then have an opportunity to ask some questions of them as we go on. I'm going to, instead of introducing each of the speakers now, I'll introduce them as they come to speak to us. And so our first speaker tonight is John Engler. John is the CEO of Shelter New South Wales, and he became the CEO there in 2020, having had a history in formation and the operation of social, affordable, and specialist housing for most of his life. I'm sure many of you are asking the question, what are the differences between those? Well, funnily enough, that's exactly what he's going to come and tell us about. So I'm going to introduce John. Please welcome him to come talk to us.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that generous welcome. I, of course, like Pastor Mandy, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay our respects. When we're talking about housing, it's particularly important to acknowledge land. Just a few things I'll tell you about, and it's a great segue, thank you, Martin, about social, affordable and specialist housing. So if we leave here tonight with a clear understanding, and you're definitely a quality audience, what social housing is, it's basically public housing. What's affordable rental housing, different from housing that's affordable, it's a particular product, and we use the capital A, but I'll give you some other terms or definitions to help explain it. And then specialist housing is generally everything else. And when I say specialist, I don't mean just specialist supported housing, any other housing that the market fails to provide. So in this country we have a history of the market generally providing lots of housing for lots of people, lots of 2-bedroom units, for example, in Pyrmont. But when you need a 1-bedroom unit or a 4-bedroom townhouse or something that's accessible or reasonably priced, we tend to find the market falls short. So Shelter New South Wales has had over 50 years the job of being able to explain that, how it is that market, we say in polite company, the market falls short, but actually the market fails. And it fails spectacularly in certain areas, particular cohorts, particular groups. And any doubt about that, we probably would have seen evidence by floods in the Northern Rivers, fires in Bega, and indeed COVID. We've noticed in particular that those responses, had there not been intervention, and that's all levels of government, we wouldn't have had the housing outcomes that we've had. Government has a very important and continuous role in making sure that where the market falls short, we as taxpayers, citizens of New South Wales, can have confidence that housing security, and it is housing security, often we just talk about affordability, but affordability is just the most immediate objective lens that we can use. Housing security is something that we all know and experience, and probably at different times in our lives not experience. So affordability is just the most obvious way we can measure it. But the real goal is to make sure that everyone, from the UN down, it's increasingly something we talk about as a fundamental human right, that people have access to secure housing that's also affordable and accessible. So just a little bit about shelter. I put this slide up, and you're most welcome to go and have a look at our website. We have lots of resources, submissions that we make to government, research papers, media appearances. It's important just to see that often the conversation at the moment is just about supply. Of course, we need supply of more dwellings. Of course, that will make a difference. But we need to talk about supply of the right type in the right areas and enough supply to make a difference. No matter how well the market otherwise provides, we reckon we still need a safety net of about 5%. I'll come back to that. But on that little diagram that you can see at Shelter, which is a dynamic one on our website, you can actually touch on each of those. We realise that there's different people within a market. There's a whole housing system or continuum, and we need to understand supply and demand. Like all markets, economists teach us this, you have to be able to have a lens on both supply and demand, otherwise you might very much miss what it is that's needed. So supply and demand, we talk about households and providers. Just on that second slide, thanks Mandy, is, and I'll be talking particularly why this slide, it looks complicated, don't worry about it too much. What it shows is that there is a whole housing system. So there's no one lever that will solve or address all of the housing issues. And what we like to show on this particular slide, we talk about a housing continuum, a whole housing system, where different people along in this case, the income streams, might need different subsidies to make sure their housing is more affordable. And the reason why I bring that up, I think most of us are pretty aware of what social housing is, public housing. In New South Wales, we used to pride ourselves on having 7, 8, 9%. We've dropped down below 5%, down at about 4.6 by even generous methods of measuring. That's quite alarming. We recognise that 5% of the stock should be provided by government, long-term, secure, and made available to people on very low income. So not just low, but very low. Often what we call a statutory income, so a pension of some type. 95% of people who live in the 150-odd thousand properties in New South Wales that are controlled through various mechanisms of the state have a statutory income. That's always needed. Increasingly though, and what's important for here tonight, and really exciting that we're hearing Sue and Jenny talk about this and your questions about it, affordable rental housing, particularly for key workers. Now the reason why we can talk about that, and on the continuum it's measured as people who might have low incomes, not very low incomes, so a subsidy towards their rental accommodation, generally we talk about it in terms of discount to market, so 25% discount to what the market rent would otherwise be. It's a rough measure, but that can make a massive difference to the lives of, often we think about essential workers. And when we mean essential, like it's nice to think about ambulance and teachers and nurses, but we really mean the carers, cleaners, checkout operators that kept us, as we say, fed, safe and watered during COVID. These people often work on long hours, travel great distances, out of work, and often for minimal wages. So what we're finding increasingly, both in Sydney and across the state, it's difficult to be compliant, for example, with your aged care governance, that you have to have a certain ratio of staff, because we can't attract the right number of people to be able to live in a town, for example. So I know there was one town on the Riverina, Moma, just 3 days ago. It's happened in Harden in New South Wales as well. We've had to shut aged care facilities because we can't get the staff to staff the facilities to remain compliant and operational because there's not enough affordable rental properties in the town. So that's when we really notice the rubber's hitting the road. There's just not enough affordable housing. So that's not to distinguish and say that it's the same as social housing. It's different, it's a new product, we increasingly need it, and we think there's a great opportunity, particularly with local government, to lean in and help out. So whilst we might argue, despite the fact that the Prime Minister rightly says that he grew up in council housing, he did, it was the South Sydney Council that owned the property he grew up in, it's now part of the state. But councils, although you don't think they necessarily have to provide public housing, they do absolutely have some levers available to them, both formal planning levers through incentives, bonuses, voluntary planning agreements, and their own volition. They can say, here's a piece of land that we've got, we'd like to see that developed for affordable housing for some key workers. And there's lots of examples, and no doubt Sue might touch on a few, from all over the state where good councils haven't waited to be dragged but have leaned in and tried to do various things because they see the merit and promote the supply of affordable housing, so capital A, affordable rental housing for key workers in their towns, their cities, their regions. The reality is we don't have that much of it. So whilst we might have 150,000 social housing units in the state, 4.5%, by today's measures, so we advocate we need more, we're lucky if we're counting about 5,000 or 6,000 properties that are unequivocally there and administered for affordable housing for key workers. And where it really gets a bit disappointing is that often they're under schemes that are time limited. So the gold standard for organisations like ours is affordable housing run by community housing organisations that's affordable for key workers, part of infrastructure, you need it, but that it's available in perpetuity. So that's the sort of framework we might have. Really happy to take questions about this stuff for tonight. I might go to the next slide, Mandy, which just touches on that dwelling numbers. So again, they look like they're big numbers, but under current management for public housing in New South Wales at the moment, and the reason why we need more upstream housing is for this reason, we have very limited, it's almost what we now call residualised public housing. There's just not that much of it. So even people who are priority have to wait. So we're flat out dealing with the priority with vacancies. We're building some, but not enough to keep up with population demand and greater need. And often that which is available, you have to wait years for it. So we're not really getting to the 60-odd thousand people who are currently on the waiting list. So the reason why we think that's particularly interesting tonight as part of the discussion for affordable housing, we often hear that older women over 55 who haven't been able to secure accommodation or are currently working but may not be, we need to have some schemes that provide some housing for them. It's worth asking the question, well, if we house that person at 55, but it's only for 15 years, where are we going to house that person when they're 70? Because the current priority list in New South Wales housing is 80, and otherwise it's up to a 10-year wait. So there are some intersectionalities, I suppose, between the various areas. Public housing, we're lucky if we're at 4 or 5%. Affordable housing, great idea. We've spent 25 years in New South Wales at least trying to promote that we need more of it. I think everyone agrees we need more of it. How are we going to deliver that? I think we can talk about councils leaning in a bit more. And then specialist housing, whether that's aged care, disability, youth foyers for young people leaving out of home care, we'll always need these at least 3 ways in which we can contribute because the market won't. I think just finally, before I push over, we just see increasing pressures when it comes to key workers in areas renting. So in this particular part of the world, we don't have as many renters as we do in other parts of Sydney, about 25%, I think. And a lot of people who own their homes there's more homeowners who are outright, and more of them own more of their home, less of a mortgage, and in fact, they're big dwellings. So when we start to look at some of those macro things, it is difficult for people who are essential workers to live close to where we have, particularly in this part of the world, hospitals, public and private, aged care facilities. We want to be able to make sure that we're not stretched getting those shifts filled and being compliant in some of those other areas. So that's where housing is not just an isolated thing that lives on its own. We often say housing problems are rarely solved by housing policy alone. That's because it feeds into other areas of our economy and structure. I think I might leave it there. Suffice to say that please think about becoming or engaging with Shelter. We're very much part of helping faith communities like yours, the 3 churches that have come together, do more and speak on behalf of good communities to say, actually, if it's done well, the density is done fairly and it's done appropriately, we very much back in good development in our areas, particularly for key workers such as those affordable housing ones. One thing that I might just point out that in the homelessness statistics, so sorry Mandy, it's the 3rd one after that. One more, that one there. So I just want to draw your attention to one particular figure because it is significant in New South Wales. We often hear a big figure about people who are homeless, 120,000 every census we do every 5 years. When we look at the 6 categories of homelessness, the most obvious ones are rough sleepers. I think we know what that means. A new one we increasingly understand called couch surfing, people living in shelters temporarily, people not having permanent. But I'll draw your attention to the last figure before the total, which is persons living in severely overcrowded dwellings. And the reason why I bring that one up is, A, it's a big figure, and it's big in New South Wales. Nearly 40% of all figures that are part of homelessness come from that figure. And it's what we would call, Sue will like this term, it's a socio-spatial issue. It's defined in particular areas of Sydney. So not this part of Sydney. There's about 3 or 4 local government areas in Sydney for which it is the case that 8 people might live in a 2-bedroom unit. So the reason why I bring that up is to give us a bit of hope and joy, saying not all these problems are insolvable or implacable, that we can't do much about it. Actually, we believe from Shelter, we could do great things to address that particular aspect of the total number. If 40% of people are 8 people living in a 2-bedroom unit, we probably do need to pull some of those Department of Housing levers to get them to build some bigger 5, 6 and 7-bedroom dwellings even in certain parts of Sydney. We could see that figure go down. So that's not to be dismissive about it. It's rather to say events like this, you coming together, being informed and hearing, actually gives us the opportunity through engagement, support and membership to do something about it when we're appealing to government. I'll leave it there, and I'm really happy to take questions later and very much looking forward to listening to Sue and Jenny. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and yeah, I think there's probably never been a time when the demand or the need for housing has been clearer, but similarly there's great opportunity. We have state, federal and local governments all agreeing furiously that we have a problem. So I think organisations, events and gatherings like this give us the opportunity to really solve it and do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I'm sure that there will be some more questions that will arise out of some of what you have spoken about. I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Sue Weatherly. Sue has spent 30 years, she's got 30 years experience in executive roles in both New South Wales and Queensland. And she's currently the Vice President and Policy Committee Convener. Goodness, I have to get my teeth in with that one. Policy Committee Convener of the Planning Institute of Australia. But she's got a passion for urban planning and for understanding the role of government within that. So please welcome Sue as she speaks to us.
Does the clicker work, or do I just make a noise? Ah, there you go. Oh, there you go.
That's actually on.
Yeah. That's on?
It should be on.
There you go. All right. So, as the planner in the group, I'm going to talk a little bit about the New South Wales planning system. And the thing I will always begin by saying about the New South Wales planning system, it is, without a doubt, the most complex and confusing planning system we have in Australia. And it is very top-down. It's a system where the state government decides what should happen, then tells everyone else to go ahead and do it. And it's always been that way. And I've worked in other states, and it most definitely is the most top-down and complex system. The key element of the planning system is set by the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act and the relevant regulations. They really set out how the system's supposed to work. There are things called ministerial directions, and that's when the minister comes out and says, and this is how you'll interpret or apply those provisions of the Act to make things work. Again, very much a top-down directive to anyone working in the system. And then the next layer of the planning system is various plans, policies, guides that sort of set out how things get done and how decisions are to be made. So it takes a little while to get to understand it. The key element of the planning system in New South Wales is, and particularly the Act, it sets out how the strategic view of the future of New South Wales or Sydney would occur. Now, for Sydney, we have a regional plan, which is called the Metropolis of Three Cities. It's currently under review. It'll become the metropolis of 6 cities soon, created in 2016. A key elements of it is setting out housing targets and jobs targets. Now, building on something that John has just spoken about, there are no housing targets in that for different types of housing. It's just a general target around of housing. So there's no discussion about how many social housing units should be built, or there should be. There's no targets around affordable rental housing either. There's also below that 5 district plans, which will be, which represent the different parts of Sydney. There's Hornsby's in the Hornsby Shire's in the Northern District, and then councils develop local strategic planning statements, which are documents that set out how all the land use and activity should occur in their area. And in particular, there's a bit of a focus on housing targets in that, and councils have to develop housing strategies because they're told they have to do so. Go back to this part of this message is it comes down from the top. There's also sometimes you hear about master plans. Master plans are precinct visions, and they set out how an area might develop in the future, but they have no legal status. They are a document for understanding what would happen in the future, but it's not. Now in this slide, I've also indicated the various authority for preparing those documents, and you'll see the Greater Cities Commission, as it's now called, and the state government prepare those high-level plans, and then the councils prepare the plans below that. And just going to make the point that it is a hierarchy, starting with the Act, the regional plan, the district plans, and then all the local strategic plans under that for the 5 districts that we have. For individual developments, doing so well. There you go. For individual developments, the decision about whether or not a development should be approved on a particular site is really a case of referring to environmental planning instruments. So there's strategic documents and then there's environmental planning instruments. And it's the environmental planning instruments which set out what can and can't be approved in different areas. The state government has state environmental planning policies and codes and guidelines which are called up in those, and councils prepare local environmental plans which have to relate to their strategic planning documents. And then there are some non-statutory documents. You might have heard about development control plans. They are not a statutory document. They have no particular statutory weight. They are guidelines only. And the reason I say this is because, as with the strategic plans, it's a hierarchy. SEPs, state environmental planning policies, override LEPs. LEPs override DCPs. You can't have anything in a DCP that is not allowed, that contradicts anything in the LEP. You can't have anything in an LEP that contradicts anything in a SEP. So if the state government wants something to be done, they can very quickly introduce a SEP and override all the work that a council may have undertaken to get to where it was with its LEP, developed after it's done its strategic planning statement. A particular clause of every LEP I want to make mention of is clause 4.6. So the state government defines what can go in your local environmental plan, which includes the zones and all the permissible land uses, and has some mandatory provisions as well. And the one that sort of gets communities upset from time to time is clause 4.6. Clause 4.6 allows developments to be approved even though they do not comply with the development standards such as height and floor space ratio. And part of the reason to talk about this when we talk about affordable housing is some variations the state government's built into some of the state environmental planning policies to give density bonuses on individual sites. So there's different decision makers for development applications as well. There's self-assessment. So In some cases, the state government agency undertaking the development can also approve their development. It's important for some of the land that's being developed for social housing, but it also applies to other agencies as well. There's a state planning panel. It's appointed by the state government and determines larger, more complex DAs. There's the regional planning panel, which is appointed by the state government and the local council, and it determines other significant development, a little less contentious probably. Local planning panels determine contentious smaller projects, and then the staff can have delegation to determine the other applications, the smaller, less contentious developments. In that environment, the councillors have no role, and this is important to understand how things occur, because really the Act sets out that the role of the councillors is to decide policy, decide the direction that the development should occur in their local area, noting that they have to make sure that complies all the state government policies, but the other people make the decision in relation to individual developments. And finally, the Land Environment Court has a key role from time to time in determining applications where there's disagreement on whether or not it should be approved or not, and they often create new rules that become points of law. So, affordable housing and the planning system. So that's the big picture view about how the planning system works, which is completely confusing. And I say that because I spent 4 hours, including a conversation with the General Counsel at Georges River Council when I was working there up until about 3 weeks ago, trying to work out whether or not we needed a DA for a market. Now, because I couldn't look at the LEP, because there's a SEP that has exempt and complying development, but it only talks about the development, doesn't talk about the use. So do we need a... Anyway, we never came to a conclusion. The affordable housing in the planning system. So nothing in the planning system requires or mandates affordable housing. There are minimum targets, as I mentioned, for housing generally in all the strategic documents, but no particular targets are set for affordable or social housing. There's no SEP that requires that to be the case, and no LEP requires that. There are, and I've said that in a way that I'll qualify in a moment. What it does do is it makes it permissible, and as a general rule, it offers some sort of bonus to the developer if a private developer wants to build social or affordable housing as part of some joint project or out of the goodness of their heart. A number of local councils have developed their own affordable housing schemes. That is a very short list. The list is much longer than that. I was just quickly thinking about it the other day. Who could I remember? The lead council in this has always been Waverley Council. Waverley Council started its affordable housing scheme in the 1990s. It was negotiating for the acquisition of units to be put into an affordable housing scheme as far back as that. Inner West, Parramatta, Bayside, Bega Valley, for example, very diverse. Central Coast Council all have affordable housing schemes. Whether or not it's making a significant difference because of the constraints and the difficulties of state policy is debatable. There's a thing called State Environmental Planning Policy number 70, and it allows councils to develop affordable housing schemes, contribution schemes, where as you do development you pay a levy to the council which goes into a pot of money to be used for the construction of affordable housing. Again, doesn't deliver very much. Another thing that's often quoted is voluntary planning agreements, where the council will negotiate directly with a developer doing a development to say, would you put in this development 5%, 10%, 20% of affordable housing? Now, to show how hard that is to do, when I was working at Parramatta at a period of time, there was a very large, it's like 15 hectares of government land. We said it should include, when they're going to rezone it, it should include social and affordable housing. So it's government land. Had previously been used for group homes. Previously been used for that purpose. the Department of Planning would not support the council's position that there should be affordable housing on that site. Just to add to this story, because I love this story, part of that site was also the former Macquarie Boys High School site. We also said, well, we're going to have all these people living in this new residential area. Shouldn't we have a school? Why don't we keep the Macquarie Boys High School, at least keep the site, even though the buildings were badly damaged because of vandalism over the years. We didn't, no, that's all right. There's plenty of schools in Parramatta. That was the Education Department. So the difficulties for council sometimes with good intent to turn those things around and get the support of state government can also be problematic. The other document or state policy that hasn't really worked, in my view, I'm happy for other people to disagree with me, is the Affordable Rental Housing SEP, which came in 2009. It gave bonuses for developers to include affordable rental housing within those schemes, but they only had to be used for affordable rental housing for 10 years. So there was going to be a cliff when all those affordable rental housing units were no longer available. There's also a new SEP out. I'm sorry, I could feel someone behind me shuffling their papers. I hope that's clear enough. But the state government's introduced a new draft SEP. This is going to solve the affordable housing shortfall in New South Wales. Now, the good thing is they haven't said that. It will provide up to a 30% density bonus where developments provide 15% of the total residential component as affordable housing for a minimum of 15 years. Not in perpetuity, for 15 years. It's saying generally other planning rules will apply, like the codes and the policies, in particular the state policies. It increases self-assessment, which is a good thing for certain state government projects. But here's the rub. There's no guarantee anyone will take this bonus up. It may not deliver a single unit of affordable rental housing for this state. Why is it 15 years? Why isn't it in perpetuity? And clause 4.6 applies, and I just talked about that before. And the reason I say that is that they have to provide 30% for 15%. They have to provide 15% for their 30% bonus, but they could argue it's not feasible and they can only provide 5% and they need a 40% bonus. In theory, that is the program being developed. There needs to be more guidelines around the operation of that. Oh yes, and this is a very contested space. Everyone has a solution. Everyone talks about the planning system solving the problem. We're going to have to redesign the planning system if you think the planning system's going to save the problem for some of the reasons I've already spoken about. It is also a very political space. The minister makes many of these decisions. He has to argue, in this case I can say we have a Minister for Planning. If he wants to change the Act, he has to get it through Parliament. If he wants to change and introduce a new SEP, he has to get that through his cabinet. So he has to win enough votes to get those things through. It's not whether or not it's a good idea, it's whether or not it's a good idea enough people will vote for. Same as the issue for councils. Enough councillors have to agree that they want to have an affordable housing contribution scheme. Enough of the community has to support the councillors wanting to do that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. The other thing that's happened very recently is at the national level is the National Housing Accord. Now, it's described, and this is the self-description, an agreement to address one of our nation's biggest economic challenges, the supply of and affordability of housing. Now, it's not specifically dealing with the issue of affordable rental housing or social housing, but it is part of it. And it's, in theory, to align everyone on the same page. The ambition is, the stretch target is 1.2 million dwellings in the next 5 years, starting from next year. And our stretch target for New South Wales is 377. or 377,000 or around about 50,000 dwellings to be built. Now, the Grattan Institute, I don't always agree with the Grattan Institute, but I'm happy to quote them because I have an interesting view on something. But their estimate was if those 1.2 million houses were built, rents would reduce by 4%. And that's where we start to struggle. So what can planning do? It can provide the rules to ensure that housing is safe and with good amenity. It can ensure that there's adequate land zoned for new housing. It can allow for and have diversity of housing. That's both affordable, social housing, different size, larger homes, smaller homes, terraces, villas, a range of housing. It can be inclusionary or exclusionary. And inclusionary zoning is when you compel people to include in a development some element. And in particular, that would be the case of affordable housing. You could introduce a law, a set that said all new developments must have 15% affordable housing. That could be a planning rule. Or it can be exclusionary, and that is one that doesn't consider things and it's always an add-on. That's where we are today. And a planning system can only allow that adequate housing be available. It can't make housing affordable, and that's taking that broader spectrum of affordability. But any of those changes take courage and political will. And if I've got 2 seconds, I'd like to just show this slide. This is a slide from the Bureau of Statistics, because I love a graph. The top line, where it's almost at 40%, starts to decline. That first line, now declining, is the number of people who own a home without a mortgage. The one immediately below it, which crosses it in about 2003, is the number of people who own a home with a mortgage. That's 2003. You also see the amount of social housing, people living in social housing, also declining from that period on. Any problem we have today was not a recent crisis. This has been happening for some years and long before this, because see how the graphs have been going down or up for some time. The number of people in rental properties have continued to rise for some years. In 2003, when that line crossed, the average house price in Sydney was $440,000. The average income was about $50,000. It's now 1.5 million average house price, and the average income's only 97,000. So it's income's doubled. House prices have almost gone 4 times. So if you want to make housing today as affordable as it was in 2003, you would have to halve the property market in Sydney. If that happened, no houses would be built, because no developer is going to make money, and that's why people build houses, because they make money out of it. That's why there's an important role for people like Shelter and others in ensuring that we do get proper government policies around affordable and social housing.
Goodness me, that's sobering, isn't it? You've taken something very, very complicated and given us an insight into that complication. So thank you very much for that. But I think you've also given us, in some ways, a challenge in terms of how we actually respond to that complexity, and particularly that top-down reality. In terms of talking about top-down, of course, we have to come to terms with what happens on the local level. And I want to introduce our third speaker for tonight, and that's Jenny Ross. I've known Jenny for a little while, involved in the Sydney Alliance, and she's the co-chair of the Sydney Alliance Hornsby local team, which is particularly looking at the issue and promoting of affordable housing in the Hornsby LGA. And she's going to come and talk to us about her particular insight into that and the way in which she's been working on a local level. So please welcome Jenny.
Thanks, Martin. And yeah, thanks, John and Sue. You set the scene, I think, for us in many ways to talk a little bit about the local scene here in Hornsby. So we've got a PowerPoint. I'd like to introduce you to Nadia. Nadia works in a childcare centre in Hornsby. She has 2 children in a local primary school. Recently, Nadia's marriage broke down as a result of her husband's abusive behaviour, and she and her 2 children had to leave their home in Hornsby and find safety in a local women's refuge. Then they had to move to transitional accommodation where they can stay, but only for 3 months. Nadia cannot afford to rent a home in Hornsby. She can't stay with her extended family because they live interstate. Now, moving to somewhere Nadia can afford is going to cause significant disruption in her life and in the lives of her children. Her children will need to change schools and find new friends. Every day, Nadia is going to have to travel up to 2 hours on public transport to get to work. That means she's going to have to put the kids into before and after school care. She's going to lose all her existing support framework, her friends, neighbours, medical providers, and more. Nadia and her children need to keep coming home to Hornsby, and we need Nadia and her children in Hornsby. How about Elise and Matt? Well, they were born in the Hornsby LGA, and they grew up here. They went to primary school and high school here, and last year they got married here. Elise is a teacher at a local high school, and Matt has been working part-time at a local restaurant and also doing some tutoring while studying for a master's in education. Money is tight, but so far it's been okay. To their delight, they've discovered that Elise is pregnant, and their baby's due in 4 months. But Matt and Elise won't be able to afford to rent in Hornsby on Matt's part-time income. Matt's parents live in the Hornsby LGA, but they live in an over 55s complex. So there's no room for an extra 3 to go there. It looks like looks like Elise and Matt will need to move to the Central Coast, possibly to Newcastle, to find a home that they can afford to rent. And to get the support that they need at this important time, they just won't have it because they'll be living away from family and their support networks outside of Hornsby. They need to be living in Hornsby, and we need them to be in Hornsby too. Perhaps you recognise a family member, a friend, a neighbour, or someone else that you know in these stories. Nadia and her children and Matt and Elise represent a large and growing number of people across our LGA who need affordable housing. And tonight I want to talk about 2 things. Firstly, the need for affordable housing in the Hornsby LGA and what people like you and me can do about it. Well, 3 years ago, neither of these things were on my radar. In fact, I didn't understand what affordable housing was or how great the need was in Hornsby. I certainly wouldn't have imagined that someone like me could do anything about it. I wasn't a member of a political party, I didn't know a politician, and I could not have told you who the relevant decision makers were. And in many ways, I'm still unqualified to speak on this topic because, as I said in the blurb for this event, I've had the immense privilege to live the whole of my life in secure housing. And increasingly, I'm learning not to take this for granted. So what have I learned in the last 3 years? Well, firstly, I've learned a lot more about who needs affordable housing in Hornsby. And in many ways, that's summarised in the stories I've told you of Nadia and her children and Matt and Elise. But how many people are there like Nadia, Matt, Elise? I know some of you will want to see the statistics. Oops. Well, that's a bit frustrating because there are no really reliable current statistics on how many people need affordable housing in Hornsby. Well, why not? Well, stick with me and I think you'll see why. What we do know is that in 2021, about 2 in every 5 people who live in the suburb of Hornsby were renters, and about 1 in 5 across the larger LGA rented as well. Well, that's a useful starting point, but it doesn't tell us how many more people need to rent in Hornsby but can't, or how many could afford to rent in Hornsby in 2021 but can't now. And to answer these questions, what we need are 3 things. First, we need to understand what rental stress is. Why? Because it's people who are suffering rental stress that need affordable housing. Secondly, we need some basic data, which is pretty accessible on the web. And thirdly, we need a tiny bit of maths. Now, don't get stressed because numbers aren't really my thing, but I could do this bit as well. So what is rental stress? It's not a difficult concept. If you spend more than 30% of your income on rent, you will be suffering rental stress. Why? Because unless you're rich, you will need to use at least 70% of your income to pay for your tax and your basic needs. Things like food, clothing, medical, transport, and utilities. And that means that if you are spending more than 30% of your income on rent, you're going to have to decide which of those basic needs you're not going to meet this week, and next week, and the week after. That's rental stress. So who can afford to rent in Hornsby at the moment? Or more important, who can't? Who is experiencing rental stress? Well, let's start by finding out how much it costs to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in Hornsby. Here's a chart which answers that question. It's not my chart, it's from realestate.com. Now, this chart tells us 2 things. First, it tells us that the current typical rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Hornsby is $535 a week. The second thing it tells us is that the situation in Hornsby has changed radically over the last 2 years. 2 years ago, the same apartment was being rented out at $430 a week. So that's an increase over 2 years of 25%, or almost 25% to be exact. So how does this information help us identify who needs affordable housing? Well, if you can't afford to spend more than 30% of your income on rent, and rent is $535 a week, how much do you need to earn each week or each year? I use my calculator to give me the answer. It's $92,733. And if we round that off to 93,000, I've put the maths on the slide if you want to check it out. $93,000 a year. At that level, what kinds of people are being shut out of the rental market in Hornsby? Well, again, we need some data, all of which is publicly accessible. Let's look at a few examples. A first-year teacher earns $85,000 per year, less than $93,000. A first-year police officer earns around $64,200, that's even less. A first-year registered nurse, $69,800, not enough. And a first-year childcare worker earns around $54,100, which of course is way too low. So none of these people can afford to live in Hornsby. Now you might be saying, well, all of these people are in the first year of their careers. Surely they're going to get a pay rise. Well, you're right. Hopefully these people are going to get paid more the longer they work, but will that make a difference? Good news. As this chart shows, the third-year teacher can rent in Hornsby. But just a minute. Firstly, that's going to assume that rents won't go up for the next 3 years. But if anyone here believes that. And secondly, where are these teachers going to live for the first 2 years? Not in Hornsby. They've gone elsewhere. And as for the rest, the news is all bad. A level 3 police constable only gets $77,300, still short. A registered nurse who's been practicing for 3 years only gets $86,800, and that's still not enough. And even the most experienced childcare worker who's looking after our kids day in, day out doesn't get anything like $93,000. And that's to say nothing of all our other essential workers who John alluded to as well, people like cleaners, orderlies, aged care workers, and all the people who work in cafes and shops as we go about our daily lives. None of them earn anything like $93,000. None of these people can afford to rent in Hornsby. So we have a fundamental question to ask. What kind of community do we want? Do we want a community which includes teachers, nurses, police officers and childcare workers? Or do we actually expect these people to live somewhere far away and commute to Hornsby every day to provide us with the services that we need? And that's before we even think about their needs, which probably we should put first. Can we agree that it's not okay to ask these people to sacrifice their personal well-being, their family and their community lives by commuting vast distances to serve our community? Why can't they live here, flourishing with us at home in Hornsby? Well, if we want that kind of community, then something has to change, and that's where we come in. And I'm guessing some of you are thinking, now just a minute, what's this we business? How can someone like me make a difference? Well, as I said earlier, that's exactly what I thought 3 years ago. But I've also learned that people like you and me can make a difference in our community on this issue. Let me tell you a little bit about how I changed my mind. It's March 2021. I receive an email from David Barrow, a community organiser with Sydney Alliance, and he's inviting me to take part in a listening event. It includes a discussion on affordable housing. Who is Sydney Alliance? Sydney Alliance brings together diverse community groups, unions and religious organisations, along with passionate individuals, all of whom want to advance the common good and achieve a fair, just and sustainable city here in Sydney and beyond. And it specialises in what's called community organising, which is bringing people together so they can have a say in the decisions that affect them, their communities, their families, and bring about real change. Well, a few weeks later, our embryonic Sydney Alliance local team of about 10 people meet by Zoom for the first time. And we discover that it's our local councillors who have the decision-making power over affordable housing, at least to some extent. And in fact, councillors with similar demographics to Hornsby, such as North Sydney, Willoughby and Waverley, as Sue mentioned, have already begun, if not for some time, been putting into place affordable housing strategies and programs. Well, Hornsby Council has gone as far as preparing a discussion paper on the topic, but seemingly no further. And we want to see more action on this issue in Hornsby. But perhaps most important of all, we discover that a huge redevelopment of the Hornsby Town Centre is in the pipeline. It's going to include a number of apartment blocks, and so we see this as the perfect opportunity for council to use the planning regulations, some of which Sue has done really well to describe to us tonight, to require the inclusion of affordable housing in this new redevelopment. But how can we get the council to act? Well, here we're in luck. The local council elections are looming later in 2021, and this is going to be a great opportunity to get the attention of our councillors. So we decide to hold a public forum, inviting members of the community and all the candidates for the upcoming council elections. And so on the 19th of August 2021, it's a cold and windy night in Sydney, but we are warm in our homes running the Coming Home to Hornsby forum, an online community forum which tests Zoom to its limits. You may remember that season. Well, 136 people from the Hornsby LGA and surrounds pop up and on almost as many Zoom screens displayed on my computer. They represent 42 different community organisations, and half of them are local churches. 6 of the 10 Hornsby councillors, as well as Mayor Philip Ruddock, attend. All are running for council in the coming term. Each of the councillors speak, putting their perspective on the need for affordable housing in Hornsby. Some, we've got to admit, are more enthusiastic than others. But we're looking for action, and we put 3 specific requests to the councillors. We want simple yeses or nos from each of them, and then we record their answers in real time for all 136 people to see. And here's what happened. We've hidden the names of the councillors so as not to embarrass them. But you can see, frustratingly, we had very few yeses. A bit of a letdown. We felt like we'd failed to some extent, and yet at least we'd put the issue on the agenda. So we debrief, we re-evaluate, and we go back to the drawing board. We research to try to understand what's going to be needed to get to yes and to succeed in getting some movement on affordable housing. And then we get lucky again because the council elections are moved from September to December. And we've got another bite at the cherry. So we meet one-on-one with some of the councillors who are willing to engage with us. We try to understand their perspective and their interests, and we try to build a relational equity, and this is a real value, a key value for Sydney Alliance. We rally the troops again and we run a second online forum, Coming Home to Hornsby, number 2. Well, incredibly, we get 216 participants on Zoom this time, so we're pretty excited, and this represents over 40 community organisations once again. We have asked the 31 candidates for the election to attend, but 7 come, some of whom are representative for all the candidates in their party. And then we put a new set of requests to each candidate. Here's what we asked. We asked for the establishment of an affordable housing contribution scheme to cover the whole of the Hornsby LGA. It's a bold ask, I'll admit. But then we came down to narrowing it to the Hornsby Town Centre Master Plan, and we asked for a target of at least 10% affordable housing in that redevelopment. And finally, we asked that the council and staff would meet with our team every 6 months to update us on how affordable housing is going in Hornsby, so a little bit of accountability. We use the same process again. We start off asking each of the councillors, will they agree to each of these requests? We get yeses from Councillor Emma Heidi, and she's been a tireless supporter of affordable housing, and we knew that she'd be supportive. And then, hoping that our behind-the-scenes work has yielded fruit, we move forward to ask each of the other candidates. And here's what happened. The yeses kept coming, much to our surprise, although to our delight. From every candidate, on every question, they said yes. Of most importance, every one of them agreed to our request to have 10% affordable housing in the Hornsby Town Centre Master Plan. We were elated, of course. Something felt like it had shifted. We congratulated the candidates, we celebrated, but we all know that a promise from a decision maker is one thing. Will it be kept? Our team has a new task. We attend the first council meeting in February 2022. We're given 3 minutes to speak, and we remind the councillors of their commitments at the forum and demonstrate our desire for collaboration with them. And over the following weeks and months, we hold our collective breath as we wait for the draft master plan to be released. July 2022. The master plan, the draft, is released, and it includes provision for, wait for it, 11% affordable housing. So we were pretty happy. We were ecstatic, we were thrilled. We congratulated the councillors, we celebrated again. But our work has really only begun. We've had to continue, and we've wanted to continue. We've made written submissions to Council on the draft master plan after it came out. Congratulating them, yes, but saying keep this 11% as a minimum. We met with a small group of councillors representing one of the council wards. And then, just as they promised, the mayor, councillors and council staff met with us to update us. But these steps are only the very beginning of the plan for more affordable housing in Hornsby. We've had some wins, yes. We've seen change, yes, but there's more work ahead of us. We have discovered that the decision makers are not our enemies. They are people whose job it is to address the needs of our community, and they can be quite responsive when communities are organised and present their needs collectively. And collectively is the key. Our approach has been to build relationship with decision makers. So, for example, tonight we invited all of the council members, including the mayor, to tonight's forum, and we got some apologies from some of them. The mayor, Tanya Salitra, Monica Ball, Sally McClelland all apologised that they weren't able to make it. But if you're here tonight, and perhaps this is the most important thing, if you're here tonight with a concern about the need for affordable housing in the Hornsby LGA and you'd like to take action, then please do come and chat with me after the Q&A at the end, and I'd love to introduce you to our team. And perhaps you could come and check out one of our meetings. We meet once a month on a Tuesday night to see what we're up to. You would certainly be welcome. But finally, it's really important that I say that this is not just my story. It's been possible because there's a team of people just like me who did the hard yards together. And some of them are here tonight, both former team members and current team members. So I'd ask Virginia, James, Elena, Bill, and if I've missed anybody else, could you just stand, because these are people sitting among you. Bill, you were part of it, come on. Who have worked really hard and come together, thanks guys, to make a change, to see a change in our LGA. It's early, it's the beginnings, but a change has happened and we're excited about that and excited about what's coming up in the future. So I'm sure any one of them would be happy to speak to you about their experience, and certainly I would as well. Thank you so much for listening, and let's look forward to more people coming home to Hornsby in the near future.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you for the good news that brings as well. It's good to hear that, in fact, it does work. You know, the thing is that we keep on talking about democracy, don't we? Well, democracy is the voice of the people. The problem is that so often the people don't think they've got a voice. And yet when they work together to do it, it's amazing what can actually happen. We're going to go into a time of Q&A. Are we going to use the microphones? Oh, okay. Are we going to use those? Okay, excellent. Okay, what are we going to do in terms of the questions? To be great if you would like to ask a question of a particular speaker, you're welcome to do that. But of course, the speakers are welcome to be able to answer anything as they go through. Are there any questions? Yes, just over here.
I think I'm like many people in the community. I don't trust politicians. And I don't trust bureaucrats either. But I am very sceptical, cynical about whether we're going to achieve the number of promised housing in the next 5 years. And where will they be located? Particularly in Sydney, where too much of our building development is actually on floodplain. So try and give me some confidence that politicians can achieve.
Well, as a woman do that, I could be offended by this. But I would say that there's a number of things happening at the same time, and I was recently at the planning conference and we were talking about the fact that we are confronting with a number of crises, and one of those actually is issues related to climate change, and the fact that we have allowed housing to be built in areas that are now unlivable. Some of those are floodplain areas. Some of those are even places in the western parts of Sydney which will be just too hot to live in. Exacerbated by the design of those suburbs over the years, with virtually no housing, with no trees, no green infrastructure, etc. So, like everything, most of our crises have occurred over many years. They didn't suddenly appear yesterday. But I cannot say that I can guarantee anything other than these are issues that there is strong awareness of now. And the conversation that we're having now about should we be moving people off the floodplain, not only we shouldn't be approving more housing, but should we be moving people off the floodplain, was not a conversation we would have had even 5 years ago. So unfortunately, we've had to wait for it to get to crisis situation for decisions to be made. But if you want to trust politicians and bureaucrats, you actually have to hold them to account for the decisions that they have been made. So, well, I wouldn't encourage everyone to attend every council meeting because I go, get a life. I would encourage you to have some interest in the decisions that are made in local councils, and I'm very impressed with the work that the Alliance has done at Hornsby Council. Now you have to hold them to account for those commitments. And my only reservation of this is because they still have to get state government approval to do everything they've talked about. You actually have to keep the state government accountable as well and hold them account for that decision. Some of the decisions that have been made in the past have been because of the lack of political will to some extent. I use the term inclusionary zoning. That's when you say, no, we don't give you a bonus for doing it. You are required to do it. The 2016 Greater Sydney Plan put forward the idea that new development should include affordable housing as a minimum. And they had a very low target for it. It didn't survive the draft document because there was no political will to do it, because no one was banging or marching to Town Hall or marching to Parliament House or going to Macquarie Street and demanding that this is actually what should happen. Imagine if they'd put that in their plans in 2016. People would be moving into those homes now. So we can't waste any more time, but you have to hold them account. If you get to vote, and local government in particular, your vote is so powerful because so few votes decide the decisions, decide who gets elected. So use your vote wisely and hold your local councillors to account.
Anyone else want to answer that one? No? Okay, yep. Bill?
Thanks, Martin. I'm here this evening as a member of the Social Justice Committee for St Vincent de Paul in Hornsby. We began advocacy for the use of the former North Connects lands at Pierce's Corner, Wahroonga, at Thornlea, the former Malt Works, at Pennant Hills, and at Eastbourne Avenue, Wahroonga in 2017. The only response to this campaign initially was from North Connects re the Malt Works land at 1 Pioneer Avenue, which, after an extensive heritage study, was found to be of no state significance and only of minor local heritage value. It was thus approved for use as a car park for workers until the project was complete. North Connects then indicated to us that they wished to maintain this tract for emergency and maintenance parking. This is a large tract of industrial land, and this makes this request by North Connects unreasonable. Were council of a mind to rezone this land, its proximity to public transport, highway and schools would make for an excellent housing development. In 2018, my wife Carmel and I were involved in organising a Vinnie's Forum on housing at Hornsby RSL, and I took part in the 2021 Zoom forum at TCBC. We've kept up a barrage of letters to the respective ministers of the Berejiklian, Perrottet and Minns governments regarding the land at Pearce's Corner, which is in the hands of Ku-ring-gai Council. Initially, local MP Matt Keane welcomed the idea of a social affordable housing development with open arms. Since we started lobbying, the land has been sold twice. And despite Minister Jackson's call for the public to inform the state of any possible surplus land for housing, it took over 6 months to receive a response to our letters. Is this any wonder? When Scott Morrison took multiple ministerial posts for himself, there was a huge outcry. How's that any different than Minister Jackson, who is Minister for Water, Minister for Housing, Minister for Homelessness, Minister for Youth, Minister for Mental Health, and Minister for the North Coast? Can one person serve the people adequately and responsibly over all these portfolios? This land has now been purchased by Sekisui House, a Japanese development company with extensive developments in Sydney, including the Orchards at Norwest, Melrose Park on Victoria Road Ride, at Wentworth Point, and at Glenwood in Western Sydney. Bear in mind, we as a community all suffered for this tunnel over a number of years. We've been given nothing back. I was not able to find a DA with Ku-ring-gai Council, but I've written to Sekisui House asking for details of any proposed development and what percentage of affordable housing will be included in the build. I suggest that all of you get on the website, look at it, have a look at what's being done on Victoria Road at Melrose Park. You might be shocked, because these developments are not your 5-story, I can tell you that. I have not received a reply yet from Sekisui House, and I'm not holding my breath that any affordable housing will be included in the development. And finally, I know this isn't a question, but a final observation to everybody here. How many of you received Keith Soames' leaflet in the letterbox this week on rentals in Westleigh? Duffy Avenue, $1,960 a week, 4-bedroom house. The house at the top of my driveway, $1,350 a week, a very ordinary 4-bedroom in Normanhurst. Another in Westleigh, $1,450 a week. Check it out. I have a daughter who is a doctor, and her husband is a doctor. They're paying $1,960 a week for a very, very ordinary house in Lindfield. And the only way they're doing it is his parents have moved into the bottom floor and are paying half the rent. So when we talk affordable housing, know what we're talking about, because $535 in Hornsby for 2 bedrooms isn't going to last very long. Thank you.
Another question?
Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I have a question for each speaker. The first one is Mr. Engler. You mentioned about 150,000 properties that are for social housing other than affordable housing. But in your slides, you also had some figures from the census that talked about, I forget the exact number, but I think, yeah, I think it was 122. Whatever, yeah. But were those figures for New South Wales or for the whole of Australia?
So, good question. So those figures, if you can hear me, are for all of Australia. So right. Intercentrally, about 120 odd thousand. They haven't actually gone up as a huge number, but that's all of Australia. Roughly a third of those figures of New South Wales. So,
Okay, so, all right, that explains a lot.
so can I just, in broad terms, so about 0.5%. So if we give the population of the country to be about 25.9 million, nearly 26 million.
But none of your figures included anything for affordable housing as such, because that's still undefined.
Well, two things. Yes, there's slight definitional confusion about exactly what affordable housing is as a product, and Sue and I have been talking earlier about we're better if we clear the air by calling it affordable rental housing. And you're right, at the end of the day, it's a small amount. I'm a big fan of it. I think it's a great product.
Okay, thanks.
But I think we've heard tonight,
Thank you.
this is
Thank
not
you.
much of it.
So now my second question is to Ms. Weatherly. Sorry, I'm just trying to understand. You talked about bonus. Okay. Now, if I'm a builder, which I'm not, you know, if someone forces me, in inverted commas, to build social housing or affordable housing, then without a bonus, I'll come to that in a minute. Without a bonus, I'm going to probably try and make the relevant percentage, whatever that turns out to be, I'm going to try and make that less quality or smaller or whatever. I'm going to try and do something. Can you please explain where this bonus is supposed to come from and how it works and whether council has any impact on that?
Well, the bonus system operates to say that that if the development is without a bonus, 100 units, you can now build 130 units, but of those 130, 15%, and I can't do the number, I should have thought about that. I should have thought about that quicker before I worked out the numbers, but 15% of those should be allocated for affordable rental housing. Now, the issue is, you're just going to say, for only 15 years. So if you dumb down the quality, it's going to come and bite you in the bottom later on if you're a developer. However, there are schemes...
I'm sorry. So the bonus is not a dollar payment from somebody. The bonus is just...
The bonus is you get more development on your site. You get, instead of building 100 units, which is the maximum you can build on the site, the scheme being proposed by the state government at the moment is saying that you can now build 130 units, and 15% of those units need to be for affordable rental housing. They need to be managed by a community housing provider for that purpose, so that makes sure that it does remain affordable, but only for 15 years.
Okay, got it. All right.
And can I just say, the alternate approach, so the alternate approach is not to say it's a bonus, to simply say every development must provide a particular number and allow the market over time to adjust to the fact that that's an additional cost built in to their schemes, and those units would then be transferred to a community housing provider.
Okay, so the developer could not only create these other units at a lower standard, right? There's nothing to stop the developer charging more for the units which are not low standard and then handing over the other units to whoever.
Within a development, the only way you can produce units of a lower standard is if you allow it by the codes. The codes say, and that's the key thing about the draft SEP and even the existing state policy on this, is the key code for residential apartment development is the apartment design guideline. Now, part of what the development industry is arguing is to dumb down that code for all housing, not just the affordable rental housing component, and that's being fought really hard because everyone has a right to live in quality housing. Irrespective, we should agree that safe and secure and appropriate housing is a basic human right and it's not just about a way of making money. The other part to that equation or argument, I think, is that developers cannot sell any unit or a house or anything more than the market allows them to. So if their costs go up, but the market hasn't gone up, they won't build it. But they act in developers act in a rational manner. They look for a minimum profit of 20%. If they don't get that on a project, they will not build. They don't just say, well, I'll build it and charge people more, because people won't buy it at that higher price. That's the market. That's how it works.
Thank you. But, you know, thank you. I understand now. The developer's not going to, he's going to bundle all these costs up, isn't he? And he's not going to, and he's going to average it out. And if he thinks there's a market, and the indications are that there is one, although we'll know with the change of interest rates, if any, then there's still scope. My third question is to Jenny Ross. Hi, Jenny.
Hi. Hello.
We met at one of the meetings, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, yes, it's nice to see this 11%, but what that number ends up being is going to depend very much on the outcome of the discussion we just had with Sue. Okay. But I note that in the case of there's a piece of property down opposite Epping Station, which was a government determined project or determination for Parramatta Council, and the amount of affordable housing in that is only 5%. So what do you think, given that there's still a whole undetermined calculation about what the real requirement is for affordable housing, what do you think the 11% is going to end up being in Hornsby?
That's an excellent question. I don't have a crystal ball, but yes, thanks for your question. I hear your concern, because as Sue was saying, this draft master plan, and in fact the final master plan, it's not a legal document which is going to require the council to put 11% in those developments. So this is where we come in as a advocacy group and as individuals who want to see that 11%. Firstly, what I can tell you is we work a lot with Shelter New South Wales. We use them as our consultants to try and understand the planning system, because it's very complicated, and they're fantastic at helping us understand what we can ask the council. All of those asks that we put to them on in those forums, we used Shelter. So I guess to answer your question, we do need to continue to keep the pressure on. We need to continue to keep researching and understanding how the planning system works and what might happen next. We need to keep meeting with council every 6 months, just as they've agreed to. We need to be speaking to the town planner. We're building a relationship with the town planner, and we need to be just continuing to do what we can do as citizens, showing up to the council meetings when they're relevant, checking out what's happening in the agendas of each council meeting. And you're right, it's by no means a foregone conclusion, and we just have to keep chipping away as best we can to show that the community wants the council to act in the best interests of all of us.
Yeah.
So
okay, thank you. Can I just conclude this? I just conclude by saying that I think it's going to be critical for you, with all due respect, not to use the Nadia and the Elise examples, but come up with some sort of real numbers about what the requirement is. And if I may say so, particularly for those people who are forced to stop work because of illness or some other reason such as that, rather than putting yourself in the position of having to allocate affordable housing to healthy people who are local workers. I think there's a real moral choice involved in some of that, and you've got to be very careful about it.
Thank
I'm
you.
sure.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Sure, just-
Thanks. Two questions. It's been covered somewhere, but the thing is, $535 a week for Hornsby, and that is inadequate for policemen, etc., etc. What will the discount be for what do you call it? Affordable housing? Will the rent from $535 go down by 50% to 200 and whatever it is, so those people can then afford it? And the second question is has there been a mathematical workout of what will be the figure? Is it 11%, 15%, 20% that will make all people on the basic dole able to afford 30% as rent?
Can I answer very quickly? Yep. So one of the things is I think I'm really pleased that both Sue and Jenny have touched on this. The reality is we use a discount to market model, 25% is generally what we call it. That's really based on an internal tax treatment to give certainty to community organisations that they're not falling foul of their PBI or their charity status. The reality is, absolutely, as Jenny's rightly said again tonight, we need to come back and just make the discussion. No one should be paying more than 30% of their low or very low income in rent. So what we often find is for people who can survive on minimum wages, if they're not paying rent, they can just get by. But trying to extract from that very minimal wage rent is where we see huge problems. So we do have a couple of things, Commonwealth rental assistance, bits and pieces, but at the end of the day, the work that Jenny's done is great. 30% of low and very low incomes, that's the metric you should be looking to.
Just to clarify that, my understanding is that the community housing provider would set the rent for that property based on the capacity to pay of that person who's renting the property. So it's not more than 30%. So the discount might be significantly less than that 500 number, but it's set so that no one in those, so they will get a discount. That's the discount below that market rate, but to the extent that they don't pay more than 30%. That's my understanding of how it works, yeah.
Just to finish, what ends up happening with one of the big organisations, so City West Housing has about 1,000 properties in the centre part of Sydney. On average, they end up charging those in order to ensure that no one's paying more than 30% of their low and very low income. It's closer to about 50% of what the market rent would be. That seems to be where they arrive at. So that 75% is the ceiling, not a floor, and it's just as much to do with tax as anything else. It's not actually a measure. It's just to show it's a different product. It's a crude analogy, but I sometimes say it's like an economy seat on a plane. We get there's an economy seat, that's the basic. There might be premium economy. Sometimes I think about affordable housing as just being equivalent to that. It's slightly different. That's the quickest way you can measure it. But at the end of the day, no one should be paying more than 30% of their income.
Any other questions? Can I just mention to everybody that you need to do it with a microphone, so just for the people online.
Sorry, everybody. There is a very good analysis for Hornsby, which has only just hit the deck, I think, from the Land and Housing Commission of New South Wales. And what that tells you is really interesting because much of the public housing in Hornsby is no longer fit for purpose. And by that, I have a friend from our church who's 97. She's living in Waitara on a second floor, one-bedroom apartment. The stairs would never pass the pub test. They're dreadful. Yet she's happy to live there, but the government is increasingly seeing that we can't be happy for her to be there. So all of that old housing around Waitara, here in Denman Parade, you know where it all is, that's going to go in the next few years if the Jackson policy is followed through, and it'll all be restored. And what that report is also showing is that in Hornsby, there's a surplus of 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. They're not wanted. The main cry is for 1 bedroom studios, and they're coming from retirees, they're coming from NDIS people, etc. And they're trying to build one-bedroom apartments rather than 2 and 3 bedroom. But if you can go on the website, it's called the LAHC, Land and Housing Commission of New South Wales.
Just on that note, very quickly, and you're absolutely right to bring that up, there is always good news stories around this, because sometimes we can get sort of in the woe, notwithstanding her Gilbert and Sullivan type numbers of portfolios for Minister Jackson. She's a member of the upper house, so she does have a little bit more capacity than representing a seat, to be fair. And she does have a parliamentary secretary for Northern Rivers now. She's very passionate about housing, and one of the things I know that she's happy to back in, to bring in your point, absolutely. Recently, the Land and Housing Corporation's powers have changed where they can have self-approval as an entity for 75 units over 3 floors. It was previously 60 units over 2. Now, the reason why that's material, and I literally saw they posted something today, by definition, we at Shelter, sort of, used to let them get away with saying, well, we've built 12 1 and 2 bedroom units, half of which are fully accessible, and the other half have got stairs. So I'm reminded of your friend. And of anyone I've ever heard speak, and often says publicly, a few others in the room will back this up, Minister Jackson says, it's the stories of the 97-year-old that I need to hear, and they're the ones that I need to tell the Treasurer about, because every time I talk about the stats, he's got better stats, you know, I'm quoting it. It's the story of the 97-year-old, seriously. And I think that makes the difference. You literally hear those stories, according to her, as the Minister for Housing and Minister for Homelessness, in a different thing. The take-home for that, which is really quite exciting, every single one of those 75 units, and I've asked them about this, by definition, will be accessible, because then it's over 3 stories, not 2. They're lifted buildings, more expensive, sure, bigger footprint, but that's a great metric. We're going from half to all. I think that's a great news story, and one of the ones I'm really happy to back in. And yeah, so sometimes we at Shelter will point out where they're not doing things well. That's a good example where they're actually doing really well, really well.
I think that's actually an appropriate place for us to stop tonight on a good news story. Because, look, one of the things that we've seen in terms of the media is we've obviously seen a lot of the bad news stories. And of course, the media just love the bad news stories, but it does bring it into our attention. For me, this is a very personal issue. And the reason why it's a personal issue is in my own background. My father died at the age of 56. I was 12 at the time. We were living in a normal house, a 4-bedroom house in South Africa. And when he died, we had no money. My dad was one of those people who was borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, except that when he died, Paul came asking for his money. There was no money. My father worked for the city council in South Africa, which he was a cashier for the last year of his life, which meant that in the end, his pension was next to nothing, even in South Africa. We were going to be homeless. At that point, we were able to get hold of social housing. And if it wasn't for the social housing, we would have been homeless. So for me, this is very personal. It's something which I've lived through for no fault of anybody. There was no addiction or drunkenness or alcoholism or mental health issues. The truth of it is my father died from a heart attack. He was there one day and he wasn't there the next, and we had nowhere to live. That's my experience. And my experience of that is the reality of saying that we need to have, at least in any civilized society, a framework in which we prepare, where we have a safety net for people in that situation. But we also have to have a safety net for people in every situation. Not only that one, because that's part of being a civilized society. The big problem for us is that for most of us, we don't live with this every day. We don't acknowledge it even every day. The reality of the number of people who are here compared to the number of people who came to our previous forum gives an example of that. Is that people go, yeah, that's not actually my issue. The truth of it is all our issues. And I think I want to thank all the speakers tonight for actually bringing that to our attention, for giving us some understanding of how the system works, because personally, I certainly didn't understand how convoluted it particularly was. The other thing, though, is that I think, as all the speakers have shown us, is that we do have the power of the people in this. And that actually, if we make our voice heard, we can actually make a difference in the way in which things happen. You know, sometimes we look at our politicians and go, you know, what a waste of time. The truth of it is that as somebody who tried running once, it's a hard job, man. It's a hard job because trying to negotiate all the different calls on the purse, on the different perspectives and the different understandings is actually a very difficult thing. I think that, in fact, as you said, John, sometimes we have to give credit where credit is due, as much as we also need to offer criticism where the criticism is due. And I'm hoping that what we would have heard tonight will give us ammunition for both, and that we may use that ammunition well in the way in which we engage our politicians on every level of government. So I want to thank you for enlightening us, for encouraging us, and most of all, for, I think, enlisting us. And I think if any of you are not feeling enlisted, that you've missed the point. If you're not part of what the Alliance can do, if you're not going to go and have a look at what Shelter can do, if you're not going to go and actually see what the government's doing and some of those organizations, well, then you've missed the point of you coming. Because it's not to go home, and in fact, you're not going to go home just yet anyway. There's a cup of tea and coffee. Okay. But the idea with it is to enlist you in that process, to become the evangelists for this process. And so I really want to encourage you to do that and to be that if we're actually going to be the civilized society that we want to claim to be. So thank you very much. We've got a little gift for each of our speakers, and Margie's going to come and share that with them. Something that's living. In fact, mine's still living from last time, so that's quite a surprise for me. She has, absolutely, because it's not me, I can tell you that. There we go. A kangaroo paw. There we go.
Thank you very much. That's very generous. Thank you. John, how much does it cost to join Shelter?
$3, thank you so much.
$3. It's not even a coffee, man. It's not even a coffee. You can make that happen. Let's say thank you very much to our speakers.
Welcome to the speaker circuit.
There's something for me to, oh goodness. I think they knew how that kill things, so they brought me something that doesn't live. Well done, well done. Can I say thank you very much for coming? Can I say thank you very much for staying as well? If you want to ask any questions, the speakers will be here for a little while to ask you some questions. If you want to find out more about the Alliance, there's a bunch of people here to talk about that. Both Jenny and, in fact, from Sydney Alliance itself, Kate is here too. So please talk to her. There we go. And come and join us for a cup of tea or coffee as we go there. Thank you very much for coming.